Alright, simple columnar. Again, we go to where we find the basement membrane. I'll show you in lab how to do that. This is fairly high magnification. You can actually start to see the basement membrane here. And then we look at the cells. These cells are beautifully and perfectly lined up, as are their nuclei. So if you focus just on the nuclei, because they're dark and easy to see, you can see it's one layer of nuclei. If it's one layer of nuclei, it's one layer of cells, and these cells run from the basement membrane to the apical surface. They're definitely longer than they are wide. So that's simple columnar. It is also for absorption and secretion. We'll find it in the digestive tract, where you'll have microvilli with it, and in portions of the respiratory tract where it's ciliated. Now, you can't see on this slide, but in addition to these cells, you have special cells called goblet cells. Those cells secrete mucus. And now, pseudostratified columnar epithelia. Again, we go to where the basement membrane is, right down here. And then count nuclei all the way to the apical surface. Well, if you do that, it looks like there's 5 or 6 layers of nuclei here, so 5 or 6 layers of cells. However, in reality, the cells are different heights, and every cell is in contact with the basement membrane for the most part. So that means it's really one layer, but it looked like it was 2. Specifically, this one is ciliated. You see the cilia at the top. And then these strange red blobs here, those are goblet cells. You'll find them in the trachea, where they are ciliated and they have goblet cells, and again in sperm-carrying ducts. Stratified squamous. Stratified squamous is going to be layers of flat cells, and you find this wherever you need protection, wherever you have a structure that gets a lot of abrasive action on it. In the epidermis of your skin, which we'll talk about subsequently in another chapter, it's keratinized. Keratin is a protein that makes them fairly hard and waterproof. When you have them as linings of other parts of the body, they're not keratinized, but they're still multiple layers of flat cells. So in addition to the surface of your skin, you've got them in the esophagus, in your mouth, and in the vagina. Again, areas that get a lot of abrasive action. And now we have transitional. Here's the basement membrane. Here's my apical surface. So you can definitely see more than one layer. However, look at how the shape of the cells change, and look at the very top where you have these dome cells. Okay, that's not a mutant double nucleus cell. Looks like an alien head. It's actually 2 cells stacked on each other. Okay, that's what makes it transitional, the fact that you have these dome-shaped cells on the apical surface and much more cuboidal-shaped cells on the basal surface. And again, this tissue allows you to stretch. So you've got it in urinary bladder, ureters, and part of the urethra. Alright, things that are very rare in the body: stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar. Stratified cuboidal you'll find in alveolar and mammary glands. Usually it's just 2 layers anyway. Stratified columnar is in some hit or miss spots, and it's really in transitional layers anyway. If I ask you about tissue, I'm not going to ask you about these 2 because they are rare. So you should spend your time understanding in depth all of the others. Alright, some other things about epithelial tissues that I mentioned briefly earlier. Glands are epithelial. Glands are parts of the body that secrete a fluid with some active ingredient in the fluid. If the gland is one cell, it's unicellular. If the gland is many cells, it's multicellular. And then furthermore, we have 2 categories here, depending on how they release that fluid. Endocrine glands have no ducts, no tube to connect them to the surface of the body. So when they release, they have to release into the blood or the lymph, and their active ingredient then is circulated to the target cells. The active ingredients here we collectively call hormones. So these are the glands that secrete hormones. Exocrine glands, completely different story. Exocrine glands have ducts, and those ducts connect the secretory part of the gland to the surface of the body. So they actually release onto the surface. But remember, a surface can be your skin. It can also be, the inside of an organ. There are unicellular or multicellular exocrines, and the unicellulars are the goblets. And what's included in here as secretory products are sebum, which is oil, milk, sweat, mucus, and saliva. There's two different modes of secretion for these kinds of glands. If a tissue's cells here release their product by exocytosis and it diffuses out, that's called a merocrine exocrine gland. You'll find those in the pancreas. That's also sweat and salivary glands. Holocrine is a little bit different. Holocrine is cells that actively divide, secrete their product, and as they get to the apical surface, they fragment or kind of pop, and the parts of them contain the fragment. Those are sebaceous glands. Other things that are epithelial, remember serous membranes. That's my diagram of the lima bean and the tape. So serous membranes are epithelial. The cutaneous membrane, or your skin, the outer layer anyway, is epithelial. And your mucous membranes are epithelial. Remember, it's the goblet cells that make the mucus. So we'll look at a lot of those in lab. Connective tissue. Connective tissue is everywhere. It's not necessarily on the surface, but it's immediately under the surface. It's in various organs. It's all over the place. Because it's a pretty varied group and it's all over the place, it has varied function. So epithelial tissue can bind things together. It can be very structurally supportive. It can protect. It can insulate. And it can transport depending on the specific tissue. Again, it's a really diverse group, so you have to understand what makes connective connective. What makes connective connective is it is cells in a non-living extracellular matrix. It's cells in some stuff that they made. The stuff that they made, that matrix, in turn, consists of ground substance and fibers. Fibers are proteins, and ground substance is the background material. Again, diverse group, so it can be avascular all the way to vascular. And we have two populations of cells in connective. If you see the suffix "site," that means that cell is mature, it's performing its function, it's usually not able to divide. If you see the suffix "blast," that's an immature cell, it can perform function, but it can divide. Lastly, before we start to look at them, connective tissue comes in categories. Again, it's a very diverse group. So we'll look at connective tissue proper, then 3 different types of cartilage, then briefly at bone, because we'll have a whole skeletal unit, and briefly at blood, because you'll learn about blood specifically in AMP2. Alright, so let's go back to the structural elements. Remember, it's cells in an extracellular matrix. Extracellular matrix is ground substance plus fibers. Ground substance can contain this protein called GAG, which stands for glycosaminoglycan. It also can contain a myriad of other proteins and secretions and compounds and minerals, so it's unstructured filler material between the cells. The deal with this protein GAG, it's huge, is the more GAG you have in the matrix, the more viscous or thick the matrix becomes. Now, I mentioned that there's fibers in this matrix, and the fibers fall into one of 3 specific ones: collagen, elastic, or reticular. Collagen, you've heard of collagen injections? Collagen is a supportive protein. It's massive, it's huge. And it has high tensile strength, which means you can't tear it. Elastic fibers are just that. They stretch, and when you let go of them, they recoil. So they give flexibility. If you combine the characteristics of both of those, you would get reticular. It looks like branched collagen. So it has tensile strength and it's a little bit stretchy. Cells, remember, can be blasts or sites. In addition to that, different connective tissues have their own specific cell types. So the prefix tells you what tissue type you're in. Fibro is for connective tissue proper. Chondro is for cartilage. Osteo is for bone, and hemos are for blood. So let's look at connective tissue proper first. Connective tissue proper's got two categories, loose versus dense. If the fibers are loose in the matrix, there's a lot of space between the fibers, that's a loose connective tissue proper. If the fibers are closely packed together, there's very little space between them, that's a dense connective tissue proper. There are three types of loose and two types of dense that we will look at. For loose, we're going to look at areolar, adipose, and reticular. And for dense, we will look at regular and irregular. All right, areolar. Areolar is supportive, it binds, it holds fluid, and it has immune system function. Areolar is usually the connective tissue that you find immediately deep to epithelial tissue. And in this rough diagram down here, you can see that. It's lying deep to this transitional epithelial here. Here's a photomicrograph of it, and at first glance it looks like it's an unorganized mess, but it's functional in its structure. The thick fibers are collagen. Okay. The darker blue ones are elastic. There are lots of different types of cells. If you see a cell associated with collagen fibers, fibroblast. In this tissue, they tend to stay fibroblasts because this tissue has to regenerate fairly frequently. You would also find a bunch of immune system cells, which is how they get immunity function. In a lab, I'll show you a picture of areolar with a mast cell. Mast cells are immune system cells that stimulate inflammation. All right, adipose. Adipose is fat. Adipose are basically adipocytes, those mature adipose cells, in areolar matrix. There's so many adipocytes, and they get so full of fat droplets that you can no longer even see the areolar matrix. You only get little bits and pieces of it, like down here. Adipose tissue is for nutrient storage, insulation, support, and even protection. Reticular. Reticular has these really dark branched fibers that look like old scary trees. Those are the reticular fibers. It forms a reticular network that's supportive and holds cells in place. So for example, you have these in your spleen. And where you find it, there would be white blood cells, immune system cells, in this supportive network. And as fluid passes by, those white blood cells would be able to examine the passing fluid and phagocytize out anything that doesn't belong. Now we go into the world of dense. See all that pink in the background that looks like lines here? It is. Those are collagen fibers. You can see now why it's called dense. The collagen fibers are tightly packed together and there's very little space between them. Dense regular has the collagen fibers all parallel. And these dark spots between the collagen fibers, those are nuclei of chondroblasts, or excuse me, nuclei of fibroblasts. My mouth jumped ahead. You find this as ligaments and tendons. Then we have dense irregular. Dense irregular is associated with joints as well, but it's not a tendon or a ligament, it's a different tissue type. Also, you'd find it in the deep, deep layers of the skin. You can just look at it and see it's not regular. Okay, there's spaces between the collagen fibers and these cells are here. Okay, and so these open spaces mean that the collagen fibers are not all exactly parallel. So this actually has tensile strength in many different directions. Regular dense connective tissue has tensile strength in one direction. Now we enter the world of cartilage. When you get into cartilage, you're now dealing with a matrix that's so thick and dense, you can no longer simply dissolve cells into it. So now you need a hole for the cell to sit in. The holes are called lacuna. And remember, now we're dealing with chondros. So this is a pretty mature cartilage, so it would be chondrocytes. Hyaline cartilage, the first of the three, is supportive and resists compression, which means if you push on it, it doesn't squish. We'll talk in lecture and lab about all the places you have it, but it's a very, very densely packed matrix full of collagen fibers, so densely packed you can't even see them as fibers anymore. Holes or physical spaces called lacuna, and then chondrocytes in the lacuna. Elastic cartilage is a cartilage. It still has lacuna. It's still got fibers in the matrix. All the same rules apply. The only difference is you have a lot more elastic tissue. These dark lines, that's elastic fiber. So that means we now have a cartilage that's very flexible. That's the external ear, your pinna, and also your epiglottis. Fibrocartilage, same concept. You have to have lacuna for cells because the matrix is dense. However, fibrocartilage has a different type of collagen, and it's all kind of parallel here, and you can actually see it. Fibrocartilage absorbs compressive shock, which means if you squish it, it actually will squish a little bit to absorb shock. So you find it as the discs between your vertebrae, as a pad between your two pubic bones, and then the discs in your knee joint called menisces. Quickly, bone, because we're coming back to it later. Bone is called osseous tissue. These are osteocytes. The matrix obviously is very, very hard, so you need lacuna for cells. Unlike cartilage, blood is highly, highly vascularized. Cartilage is avascular. Osseous tissue is calcified. In that matrix, there's a calcium phosphate salt that makes it hard. Osseous tissue has an incredible amount of collagen in it for support and tensile strength. It's protection, movement, because we use muscles to move them, mineral storage, and blood cell formation. This is an example of compact bone. It's on the outside. Inside bones, you have something called spongy bone, which has a different cross-sectional appearance. Blood. Blood is a connective tissue. It cells in a matrix. Whereas bone has the hard matrix, blood has a matrix on the extreme opposite end. Blood's matrix is liquid, mostly water. You have red blood cells, which are erythrocytes. You have thrombocytes, which are platelets. And then you have 5 different populations, minimum, of white blood cells. More about that in AMP2. Nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is brain, spinal cord, nerves, and tracts. Cells here fall into 2 categories. If they are electrically active, it's a neuron. If its job is to support neurons, it falls into a category, neuroglia. Neurons have axons, dendrites, and soma. Soma are their cell bodies. Axons are the big process coming off the cell body that does not branch. Dendrites are the processes on the cell body that do branch. So if this was a neuron, this would be the cell body, the nucleus and organelles would be there. Those would be the dendrites. That would be the axon. Neuroglial cells, their structures vary depending on if your central nervous system or peripheral nervous system. We'll have a lengthy conversation about these 2 tissue types when we hit the nervous system. So these are neurons, and these teeny little cells, those are neuroglia. Muscle. Muscle cells have 3 different tissue types. They all allow us to do movement of some type and generate heat specifically for one kind of tissue type. They're skeletal, associated with your bones, cardiac in your heart, and smooth, which is your organs and your viscera. Skeletal tissues are very long and cylindrical. They tend to be called fibers because they're so long. Skeletal muscle cells are multinucleate, many nuclei. They're under voluntary nervous system control. They have stripes in them called striations that come about because of the proteins in them. And again, these are your traditional muscles. Cardiac muscle cells are branched cylinders. Okay, they're still striated. They still have stripes to them. Because they're branched, there's a little bit of connective tissue between them. And what they have that nobody else has are intercalated discs. An intercalated disc is a structure between cells that allows them to contract at the same time. So obviously this is the heart, and this is involuntary muscle control. The last of the three is smooth. Smooth muscle cells are said to be spindle-shaped. They're kind of long and stretched. They're involuntary control, but they are not striated, no stripes. Completely different arrangement of proteins. You find these in blood vessels and tube-like organs. All right, briefly tissue repair, because we'll go through it at length in lecture. When you damage tissues, you have to go through 3 processes to fix them. Process number 1 is inflammation. Inflammation brings blood to the site of the wound. And what's blood have in it? White blood cells to phagocytize bacteria, and fibroblasts, and all sorts of chemicals that stimulate the healing process. Inflammation is followed by organization, which is followed by regeneration. Inflammation occurs when you cut yourself because macrophage, which are specialized white blood cells, and mast cells see the damage and secrete chemicals. These chemicals bring more blood to the site. They make the blood vessels get really big, and then they make the blood vessels leaky. So all the immune system cells and blast cells can come to this site and get out of the blood vessel into the wound. You also trigger a clotting cascade. You form a blood clot to stop blood flow. And your lymph liquid kind of gathers when it gets swollen, but macrophage will come by and remove the excess as well as all the dead cells. Organization is when the cells start to divide to replace what was broken. Blood vessels, endothelium, epithelial tissue divides to replace the broken blood vessel. Fibroblasts divide to replace the areolar connective tissue. And the epithelial tissue begins to divide to replace what was lost there. So all this brand new tissue is called granulation tissue. It's the hallmark of organization. In organization, once you get some new tissue laid down, then the edges of the wound contract towards each other to kind of straighten them. And lastly, we have regeneration. Regeneration is noted by fibrosis. That's scarring. You have extra fibers laid down to reinforce this repair. The surface epithelial is completely replaced at this point. All these fibers in this fibrosed area contract, pull in, again to reinforce the repair. You can see the blood vessels completely fixed, and in some people they'll scar. So there are some conditions that affect the ability of any of these 4 tissues to repair. Some of them are highly regenerative, like epithelial tissue. Bone is highly regenerative. You know, you break a bone and as long as it's set, it's healed in 6 weeks or so. Connective tissue proper, highly regenerative. These tissues all have a really, not a matrix that's not dense at all, or no matrix at all in the case of epithelia. And they either have a rich blood supply or access to a rich blood supply. Also, the cells have the ability to conduct mitosis. Cells that are moderately regenerative is some types of nervous tissue cells and some cardiac muscle tissue cells. Again, it depends on the extent of the damage. Things that are slightly regenerative is cardiac tissue and skeletal muscle tissue. So that's pretty much it. We're all done reviewing the tissues. After tissues comes integumentary system or skin.